everybody. Week 3, corporate social responsibility. Okay, so we're gonna get into it. What are stakeholders? Stakeholders of a corporation. So basically, the primary stakeholders in a typical corporation are, like, remember how we talked about stakeholders before? So the primary stakeholders, a typical stakeholder in a corporation is investors, employees, customers, and suppliers. So, however, with increasing attention on corporate social responsibility, the concept has been extended to include communities, governments, and trade associations. Okay, like we said, stakeholder is anyone who has who is affected or has an interest, or anyone who really is affected by the way a corporation handles itself. Okay, so like we said, investors, employees, customers, suppliers, and now communities, governments. Okay, so understanding stakeholders. So stakeholders can be internal or they can be external to an organization, like we just said, right? Internal stakeholders are people whose interest in a company comes through a direct relationship, such as employment, ownership, or investment. So internal stakeholders are anyone who have a direct um, relationship or interest in the company. So like we said here, employees, people who own the business, and people who've invested in the business. External stakeholders don't work directly with the company, but they're still affected by the company and the actions of that company somehow. So suppliers, creditors, and public groups. Okay, they're all considered external stakeholders. What's an example of an internal stakeholder? Okay, so like we just said before, for example, a venture capital firm decides to invest $5 million in a technology startup for 10%. The firm becomes an internal stakeholder of the startup. So as soon as they invest that $5 million, they are now an internal stakeholder. So the return on the venture capitalist firm's investment hinges on the startup's success or failure, meaning that the firm has a vested interest. Okay, so when a venture capitalist puts in $5 million into a company, invests in a company, a startup company, they have in a vested interest, means they have a ongoing um, an ongoing interest in the company, and it will be affected if the company does well or it does bad. It doesn't do well. So they can either lose their money or they can grow their money. So that's an internal stakeholder. Example of an external stakeholder. So like we said, doesn't have a direct relationship. So for example, when a company goes over the allowable limit of carbon emissions, for example, we saw this in the Volkswagen scandal, right? How they were showing that their cars are less, they're giving off less emissions than they actually were. It was a huge multi-billion-dollar scandal. So for in this example, the town in which the company is located is considered an external stakeholder because it is affected by the increased pollution. Okay, so that's an example of an external stakeholder. The government's also an external stakeholder. When the government initiates policy changes on carbon emissions, the decision affects the business of any entity with increased level of carbon. Okay, so governments are also external stakeholders. What are some problems with stakeholders? A common problem that arises for companies with numerous stakeholders is the various stakeholder interests may not align. So when you have a company and you have so many different stakeholders, let's just take, for example, okay, see, there's an example here. So in fact, the interest may be in direct conflict. Okay, so for example, the primary goal of a corporation from the perspective of the shareholders is to maximize profits and enhance share value. So if you're an investor, right, and you're a shareholder, not a stakeholder, you're a shareholder, which means you hold value, you own part of the company. Your main goal is to see that company make money. Why? Because you make money if that company makes money. Okay? Now, since labor costs are unavoidable for most companies, companies may seek to keep these costs under tight control. This is likely to upset another group of stakeholders call this employees. So now when you're a shareholder and you're doing your best to maximize your profits, what you're going to do, what you're going to want to see is trying to decrease your costs. By decreasing your costs, you maximize your profit. So if you're selling something for $100 and your cost to make it, your labor and all that stuff, operating costs after everything's paid, it's $80 to get that product into the customer's hand. So you have $20 of margin. Instead of raising the price and upsetting the customers, what the shareholders would want to see is, how do we decrease costs? How do we pay our employees less? And then instead of having a $20 deficit, or sorry, $20 margin, we can have a $30, $40 margin. So it's a win situation for the stakeholders that are there, that are the shareholders, but it's a lose situation for a stakeholder that is an employee, right? So that's the issues that come up within stakeholders. Another issue is, let's talk about the Volkswagen emissions scandal. The people who were hiding the excess emissions from these cars, they were hiding that because they wanted to maximize the return and profits for the shareholders of the company. Who was negatively affected by that? So positively, the people who were affected by it were the shareholders, because the price of Volkswagen was just going up and up. Now, the negative effect of that was the environment, the people who have to breathe in these emissions and what it's doing to the environment. So that's basically the prime example of the problems that occur within stakeholders. Okay, so stakeholder is the people who are affected by this company are negatively affected by Volkswagen because they were told one thing and now their emissions are much higher than what they noted down, right? And then but your shareholders are happy because they're making money. So let's talk about stakeholders versus shareholders a little more. So stakeholders are bound to a company by some type of vested interest, usually for a longer term and for reasons of need. Okay, so stakeholders are long-term and they're usually there because of a need. Meanwhile, a shareholder has a financial interest, but a shareholder can sell a stock and buy different stock or keep proceeds in cash. They do not have a long-term need for the company and can get out at any time. So, for example, a shareholder of Tesla stock, okay, a stakeholder of Tesla stock versus a shareholder of Tesla stock. Now, a stakeholder of Tesla would be the community, right? The community who is benefiting from non-emissions, zero emission cars. You have those guys as a stakeholder. So it's ongoing for the rest of for life. Okay, people who are affected by emissions, by there could be farmers who are affected by emissions. There could be humans who are affected by emissions. There's just regular population affected by emissions. So those guys are long-term stakeholders in Tesla. Now, a shareholder would be someone like me who says, hey, you know what, Tesla shares dropped, let me buy some. And then share price goes up, boom, I sell my Tesla share stocks. So that's the difference between stakeholder and shareholder. Shareholder is very short term and they put their money in, they can take it out whenever they want. A stakeholder is someone who has more of a long term. Okay, so for example, for companies performing poorly financially, the vendors that company's supply chain might suffer if the company limits production and no longer uses their services. Similarly, employees of the company might lose their jobs. However, shareholders of the company can sell their stock and limit their losses. Stakeholders versus shareholders. Okay, guys? So, if you're a manager, what is your responsibility to stakeholders? Well, first off, profitability. You need to make sure the business is making money. Okay, if you're a manager, Your responsibility to stakeholders, the first thing is your shareholders or the investors or the owners need to see that the business is making money, first off. Second is disclosure. Disclosure means you need to provide full and timely disclosure of all information to the stakeholders. So if anything goes wrong with the business, anything good or bad, you have to present that information in a timely fashion and complete complete transparency to the stakeholders. That's your responsibility to your stakeholders as a manager. So, for example, I'm a sales and project manager at this at the company I work at full time right now, and my job is to first out of anything as a sales and project manager, I need to make sure we have sales on the books. If we don't have sales on the books, I'm not doing the first part of my job, which is bringing in sales. Second is disclosure. I need to disclose everything to the owners of the company to show, hey, this is what we have, this is how much we have on the books, this is the type of business we're in, this type of contract I got. So you have to disclose all the information. This is the amount of sales that I've brought in for the year. These are the margins, all that stuff. And then ethics. So basically, you have to be able to be ethical in your performance. So, for example, for me, um, I have to make sure that all the sales that I'm getting are not done in a unethical manner, as in taking bribes or doing things for people for a low price and then getting a cut on the return, like stuff like that. Like we can't do I can't do things like that. That's highly unethical, and it harms the business. Okay, and then consideration. So for a small business, the owner might be able to manage all the stakeholders' relationships. However, as small business grows, the number of stakeholder relationships can grow exponentially, making it impossible for one person to manage all of them effectively. Support structures for managing stakeholders include investor relations department, public relations manager, stuff like that. So considerations would be stuff like, let's just say that my business grew so much that I couldn't um, directly speak to my investors or my stakeholders. So what you would have is you can I can put into place hire a team or a person to come in and say, and just talk to the stakeholders and give them all the information that they need and stuff like that, so managers don't have to do it. So what's a stakeholder analysis? So it's a process of identifying these people before the project begins, grouping them according to their level of participation, interest, influence in the project, and determining how best to involve and communicate each of the stakeholders groups throughout. Okay, so stakeholder analysis basically is you're just grouping your stakeholders. That's all you're doing. You're grouping them into who is the most important and who is the least important. Um, so what's the purpose of stakeholder analysis? So stakeholder analysis basically is um, to the reason for to have a stakeholder analysis is to enlist help of key organizational players to gain early alignment among all stakeholders on goals and plans and to help address conflicts or issues early on. Okay, so this is the main reason for stakeholder analysis. So how do you conduct a stakeholder analysis? Okay, so first you determine who your stakeholders are. Second, you group and prioritize stakeholders. And third, you figure out how to communicate with and win buy-in from each type of stakeholder. Okay, so basically, very straightforward. This is stuff that you do even if you're making any type of decision. Okay, so if you want to see what type of stakeholders you have, you would first determine who your stakeholders are, then you group them together, and then you figure out how to communicate with them in order for them to effectively work with your business. So determine who your stakeholders are. So list of potential stakeholders could include all these here, right? Finance, sales, marketing, procurement, consultants, operations, IT, right? So just start by brainstorming your team a list of possible stakeholders for your project. Second, you group and prioritize stakeholders. Okay, so look at the power interest grid here. power on the left, interest on the bottom. So it goes from low power to high power, low interest to high interest. Okay. Players. If you see players, obviously they're on the high power, high interest. So these are the ones who we want to collaborate and keep fully engaged. So these are the guys who have the biggest interest and have the most power. So for example, if I'm trying to sell something to somebody, I'm going to find the person who has the power, the decision making ability. I'm not going to talk to the person who has to talk to the other guy, talk to the other guy. I'm going to talk directly to the person who makes a decision and the person who has the highest interest in what I'm doing. Okay. And then everything else is just, it makes sense, right? So subjects, these are the lower power, high interest. So people who can offer great insights and ideas for the project, but whom you don't need to always say yes to. So these are people that can give you a bunch of information and all that stuff, but you don't have to say yes to everything they say. Players, you want to say yes to everything they say because they have the interest and the power. Context setters, they have a lot of power but low interest, right? Can have a lot of influence over the project but don't want to be involved in the details. All you have to do is keep them up to date. And then finally the crowd, low power, low interest. So these individuals just need some ongoing information, communication about the project's process, but they don't care. They're the ones who care the least. And that's it, guys. End the slides. So I'll be seeing you guys in class, all right? See ya.